John, welcome. Last time we saw each other, we were in Canada, where, of course, we saw F1, the movie. I don't know about you, but I'm quite looking forward to our chat, because I think we've got a few little areas where we do have a difference of opinion on this, which always makes for good podcasting, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think this is a film, and I think it's going to be true amongst kind of our readers and followers and club members, that is going to divide opinion. I think people are either going to love it and think it's brilliant and the best racing movie they've seen, or they're going to hate it and think this was a missed opportunity and it doesn't stack up, and it's back to drawing board to see how version 2 can go.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to see the mainstream critics seem to have been all over the map in terms of their reactions to it. So, yeah, I am interested to see what our listeners and members of the Race Members Club in particular have to say about it. Now, if anyone's wondering where Scott Mitchell-Malm is, we would have liked to have had him on, but he's not actually seen F1 the movie yet. So even though he's followed the production very, very closely, he's not actually here. I'm sure we'll hear his opinion in due course when he does see it. But he has made a contribution because he interviewed producer Jerry Bruckheimer. And in the second part of this podcast, you'll hear his interview talking about the making of the movie. But John, let's start off with the big picture, because F1 collaborated very closely with the makers of this movie, Bruckheimer and director Joseph Kosinski, primarily because of what it could do for F1. So is it going to work on that score?
I think as a overall picture, in terms of people outside of the Formula One ecosystem at the moment, I think this has the potential to be similar to what Netflix did in terms of drawing a new audience in. I think what's quite hard for sports to do is to kind of evolve and keep attracting a new audience. You can do all you want to the racing. We can, change tyre strategies, come up with 2 stops. We can create new rules to get new racing, but that's only really good for racing fans. Whereas I think now an audience comes in for different reasons. Now people are coming across for personalities, they're coming across for storylines, they're coming across because of action. And I think, and this is something Jerry Bruckheimer mentioned in our showing, that they did I think what they call focus groups, and I think they had 20 people in a focus group talking about the film, and they asked them how many people here had watched Formula One before, and I think they had one hand go up. Then they watched the film, and then they asked everyone afterwards how many people now wants to go and watch a Formula One race, and everybody put their hand up. So I think it will draw a new audience in. The question then is whether people watch that first race and go, I'm coming back, or if they watch it for, oh, this isn't really for me, and disappear off again.
Yeah, they might find there's not enough teammates calling strategy from in the cockpit, perhaps, as the movie promises them. But yeah, it's very interesting, because it does mean I do think there's kind of a fundamental tension in this project, because F1's so involved, because it's seen as kind of a big glossy promotion for F1. I do wonder if that's slightly competing with the objectives of just making the best possible movie. So it is very interesting. But let's talk through one of the main discussion points that's been ever since it became clear what the plot of the movie was. Obviously, Brad Pitt's casting is the kind of key question, because he turned 60 during production. His character, Sonny Hayes, has supposedly been out of Formula One for 3 decades when he came back in. Do you think they got away with that?
Yeah, I'm not sure on this, because I know you and I spoke about this after the film. I think in terms of timeline, being away for that long, and the reference to, a crash in the Martin Donnelly era and coming back now, I think it kind of works, because, he has washed up, I think, being a New York taxi driver, for example, racing in sports cars, pondering the Baja 1000, all those elements. So there is still that link with racing. It's not as if someone's had a crash, left Formula One, disappeared off to run a shop for 30 years, and then jumps back in. So I think they get away with that. And while Brad Pitt is a tremendous character, massive draw, there are times in the film he does look a bit old. You just think, does he seem to be too old to be competing in Formula One? But then equally, the audience who are watching this will probably be more drawn in by the fact that Brad Pitt is there, rather than having a character that another film star who is maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, or somewhere around there. So I think you're juggling 2 things. I think they just about get away with it, but it's quite marginal.
Yeah, I must admit, in a film that I have quite a few problems with, I actually didn't mind this. I think you make certain concessions, shall we say, for a Hollywood movie. So that at no point really troubled me. Other things did, but I I kind of said, yeah, you can have that as a given, and I thought they even actually tried to make it work quite well, because they obviously introduce his backstory. There's a scene initially where he's racing at the Daytona 24 Hours. Actually, I think that's probably the most impactful racing scene of the whole movie, which probably wasn't F1's intentions. It's a great advertisement for the IMSA Sports Car Championship, certainly from that regard. But then when he meets up with the Javier Bardem character, who's his old teammate, who gets him back, all of that, actually, I sort of said, yeah, okay, I'll give you that. I didn't really mind it, but I may have been just generous in saying, well, that's just what's going to happen, and had lots of time to kind of get used to it. But it was no more concerning for me than the fact that the drivers in it didn't have tree trunk necks. Because obviously, as well as I do, all Formula One drivers have giant necks, don't they? That's just what happens. And obviously, you notice that when you deal with them all the time. And Brad Pitt and Damson Idris, who plays his teammate, don't. So for me, that seemed a fairly minor concern, but I guess this is all about the whole question of authenticity, isn't it? And the sort of how accurate its depiction of Formula One is. And this is another interesting question, because I feel this was something that the filmmakers, they kept talking to us about. We had a number of occasions where we heard from Kaczynski and Bruckheimer and had some briefings on how it was all working, and they were very keen on stressing the authenticity side of things. How well do you think that works? And do you think that striving for authenticity is a thing that this movie kind of should be doing?
What I liked about it was that the success in the end didn't come from a racing cliche of suddenly you push the accelerator pedal down some more, or the team gets to the final race and suddenly they realize there's 8 gears in the car and they were losing half a second. So it's not this ludicrous step that some racing teams fall into of being some normal element that is key to the success. So on the authenticity front, I think it does well. The general improvement of the team over the season is down to a upgrade, despite what the FIA tries to do to that upgrade. And in the end,
extremely incompetent FIA, funnily enough. How I bet the FIA loves that. Loves that. They're very, very easily fooled, the FIA. Let's put it that way.
And the fact that a lot of the racing aspects in terms of race results and success is down to tyres and tyre strategy, which in a season like this, it's been a year where tyres and tyre strategy and tyre choices have been very, very important to the outcome of races. And that also carries through, choices made in practice and qualifying have had impact on the races on Sunday. So when the team wins in the end because of a tyre strategy, that's a mirror of what happened, for example, with Nico Hülkenberg in the Spanish Grand Prix, when had an extra, soft tyre left and made the most of it and had success. So on the authenticity front, it fits those. And also some of the aspects that aren't truly authentic or you question, like deliberately knocking front wings off and damaging your car to trigger safety cars to allow your teammate to run long, or holding up other cars and all this manipulation of positions and stuff. You then think, if they had put Singapore 2008 in the film as a scenario, you think, well, that's ludicrous, because no one would ever tell their teammate to deliberately crash, pit on however ridiculously early in the race, and then come out and win it. So you've got that aspect. And then if you had Monaco this year, for example, if the pair of them were, deliberately holding people up by 5 seconds a lap, getting free pit stops, swapping positions and repeating it, you think, well, this is ridiculous. This would never happen. So I think the difficulty of a Formula One movie is F1 itself in the real world throws up so many ludicrous situations that you cannot beat with fiction. So you're treading that line. I think the only downside perhaps is that all the main narratives and key racing moments are all done by, either pushing the boundaries of the regulations and doing silly stuff like deliberately causing safety cars or incidents. I think there's a bit too much of that rather than it being, genuine racing progress at times.
I was very surprised that for all the talk about spectacle, they had limited kind of racing spectacle in it. That was very strange. And I think actually they tangled themselves up a bit too much in things like tyre strategy and the like. I think I just feel just as a narrative movie that just got a little bit wrong, because there's points where there's a few times we're having briefings and that kind of thing, and it's like, well, this strategy we start on medium, switch to hards, etc. I found it really weird, And I feel like they almost said, "Oh, we've got to have this in here." There's a lot of things that I feel they put in to kind of be authentic, but I just think get in the way a little bit. It just seems really, really strange, and I don't I don't think it kind of played to its strengths, and that's kind of just that pure visual element of it. And I think that's also reflected in the fact there's an enormous amount of just explaining what's going on in it, because you'd want the visual elements to really stand on their own 2 feet, but so often they're having to have either characters talking over it or radio communications or Martin Brundle and David Croft doing commentary to explain what's going on. So I feel like they, with good intentions, went down that path. But I wonder if in the cold light of day, when they look back on it, they think, actually, I think we just let some of that detail get in the way of good storytelling. What do you think about that?
Yeah, maybe. But I think this is the problem of having a Formula One movie, is that, we report on 23, 24 races per season. And most of the time when you come out of a race weekend, there's a very logical explanation as to why things have been won. Either the car was quicker, or the tyre strategy was better, or the driver didn't make a mistake. And then you can't really repeat that for, what do we see, 8 races in the film? It was like a half of a season. So it gets a bit repetitive and boring if it's just best car wins, best driver wins. This didn't happen. So you kind of need to kind of dig behind it. But I just wonder if there's not enough of a story to the racing itself that works in a movie, because F1 itself offers us things that are massively spectacular. I mean, if in the movie, if Brad Pitt had driven into his teammate the way Lando Norris did in Canada, for example, you think, well, that's ridiculous, because no driver would just drive up the back expecting a gap to appear. Surely he would have gone the other way. But these things happen in the real world, and I think that's difficult for any film to kind of get across and overcome.
Yeah, I think that's the curse of sports movies as a whole, in that when you're focusing on the on track, on pitch, or whatever your playing field is, everything that seems outlandish just seems too outlandish, even though you can probably come up with all sorts of examples of how this happens. So that's a little bit tricky. But at the same time, I think their attempt to kind of build up the drama within the team, and it had to be within the Apex GP team, because there was one team in particular that was very keen. It wasn't painted as the bad guy in this, which was Red Bull, but it has to all be internal. And I feel like the kind of drama element almost it's not really sold. That's sort of where I think they suffer a little bit. They've got all this fantastic footage, and technically it's fantastic what they've got, but they just sort of, the story falls away, and then I think that's almost reflected in some of the chaos of particularly in the second half of some of the on track scenes. So maybe it just loses its way from that regard, just of having that underpinning storyline that you don't expect Shakespeare from a sort of blockbuster popcorn movie, but you do expect something that hangs together. You've got that in, say, Top Gun Maverick, which is the same director, and obviously people have said this is like Top Gun Maverick but with F1 cars rather than jets, but I don't feel it works as well as, say, Maverick does.
Yeah, I think, because I think we as we discussed this after Canada, the villain of the film, who's the board member owner, who basically wanted Brad Pitt to fail, so then they could take control of the team. This only becomes evident right towards the end of the movie, and then suddenly it makes sense as to why Brad Pitt wants to be back in the car and wants to do this for the good of the team. Whereas the first hour and a bit of it, there's been none of this kind of behind the scenes tension. All it's been that if this team doesn't win a race, the team will be sold, and that's the end of the owner's dreams. So I think there are elements of maybe the storyline could have been shunted around a little bit to make this a little bit more obvious.
Yeah, it does seem to lose that, because there seem to be multiple narrative threads they sort of start to pull out and then abandon during it. So I feel like they almost didn't commit to a storyline. So I do wonder how much of it kind of ended up being a little bit of an afterthought to the technical side of it, if you like, because it does start to lose its way a little bit in that regard. But we should say that the visuals are stunning, aren't they? I mean, I again think I would say my main feeling on this film is it's kind of 20-25 minutes that works really well, and then it kind of loses its way quite badly. But the early stuff, the Daytona 24 hours shooting, and that there's early stuff at Silverstone when they're testing, and then even into their first race, that I think works really well in terms of just the visual impact. And those are racing cars like you've never seen them before.
Yeah, I think all the racing scenes were fantastic. I especially liked the starts of the races and the way they were portrayed and done in terms of the intensity of it, and the silence of those moments before the lights go out. Because you're normally watching on commentary and the commentators are talking and building all up, but it goes from the silence and the lights go, and then just that they somehow just magically get that explosion of the race start that pulls away, and those first moments where they're accelerated forward, they're looking at where traffic is, and all that sort of stuff. It's stunning, and some of the race scenes as well. When you're re-watching races from last year and the year before, with Apex cars bang in the middle of the pack, and I couldn't work out in my head which car they replaced or how they'd done the CGI. It just looks like the Apex car was racing genuine other cars, and I thought that looked incredible. So I wouldn't fault them at all in terms of the racing aspects. They've got some fantastic angles, fantastic treatments, especially the race starts. So all the action stuff, I'd give it 10 out of 10. I know you had a few little elements of some of the action you didn't like.
Yeah, there were a few times. There's only a few where I think, because most of the stitching in they do is brilliant. You're right, and you're at the point where you sort of watch and you think, I'm sure that Apex car wasn't there on the first lap of that race. But there are a few times when the scaling seems to go wrong. I don't know what the technical reason be for that, but there's one point where there's a Haas that's a very different size to the Apex car, and so that's just not quite gone right. There's only a few times, but that did grate a little bit. Probably I'll notice that more than others, and I'm interested to watch it again to have another look at some of those as well. I do also think you're right about the sort of quiet before the start, but I feel like the racing scenes weren't allowed to speak for themselves visually because there was so much just noise going on over them. There was commentary explaining what was happening. There were characters sometimes explaining stuff. And it's like, well, if you can't visually tell the story with what's going on, doesn't that slightly defeat the point? You don't have in Top Gun Maverick endless explanations of all of the technical sides and what they're doing. Some of it's just, wow, there's a jet being amazing. And I just feel they lost that a little bit. That was my big reservation. But the camera technology they've got, the way they do it, that there's enough in it that if you're a Formula One fan, as anyone listening to this will be, you're going to be impressed and see some things that you're like. But I actually thought it worked better when it was simpler earlier on, in terms of the way the cars were kind of moving around, etc. And some of them later on, like the Vegas track stuff, was a bit weird, and just at times it got a bit confused, and I didn't, despite the fact there's people explaining it all the way through, it's not entirely clear what's going on. So maybe I'm being harsh, but that's the feeling I kind of had. We'll come back to some of our impressions shortly, but let's take a break and then we'll move on to hearing a little bit from the filmmaker's side. Right, let's hear now from Scott Mitchell-Malm and, more importantly, producer Jerry Bruckheimer, the legendary producer responsible for endless blockbuster movies, Top Gun Maverick, Pirates of the Caribbean, Days of Thunder, The Rock, loads more. So over to Scott with Jerry.
Well, look, I've been in the briefings that you've done since the very first weekend at Silverstone, some of the off-the-record stuff, some of the on-the-record stuff. For me, it's been fascinating to see first how the paddock turned into a live movie set, how you got different parties and stakeholders to buy into it, seeing clips of the trailer, and now the excitement building up to the actual release of the film through the soundtrack. What about you? You've been through the movie making process so many times. How unique an experience has it been for you?
Well, it's been fantastic, because what's so exciting for me is to be a part of the sport itself and be able to come to all the races and follow the escalation of the sport around America, thanks to ESPN and Drive to Survive, and then meeting all the drivers and the team principals and knowing Stefano and just being part of this amazing circus that moves 22 times a year. It's just fascinating to see how this is all organized and what an amazing job they do. I mean, just moving their like the Mercedes whole trailer, and it's unbelievable. it's like a military operation.
Yeah, and the authenticity of the movie has been so important to you, to
Yes.
Lewis, to the people involved from the very start.
Yes.
For that very reason, how important was it to capture so much of it from events themselves? Because you could have hired so many tracks and done everything in private, done everything with special effects or however you wanted to do it, but you seem to really want to capture what F1 was really about.
No, Joe Kosinski, who directed Top Gun Maverick for us, loves authenticity, and he put 6 cameras in the cockpit of a F-18 that goes subsonic, hypersonic speeds. So just to mount them and make sure that there's no vibration and you can really see the actor and everything else. Well, he took it to another level on this movie. The cameras were this big. We put 6 of them in the cockpit. They're this big now. And the one thing we couldn't do is we couldn't remotely control them. Now we have technology that we can remotely control it. So we can pan from Brad to Red Bull, and Brad to Mercedes, or we could pan, which is really exciting. And when we're done, I'll show you the trailer. There's a new trailer that's coming out in a couple of weeks, so you can see some more of what we filmed. But, the way this whole thing came together is that Joe Kosinski pitched me the idea. I want to make an F1 movie, and here's the basis and what I want to do. And then we brought in Aaron Kruger, who wrote Top Gun Maverick. So he fleshed out the story. We went to Lewis and had lunch with Lewis and said, because Lewis had interest in acting in Top Gun, but when he heard our schedule, there's no way he could do both.
Yes,
Yeah,
I remember him telling us that.
He couldn't
seemed
do both.
so disappointed.
So we went to him, he got excited by the idea, and we had got Brad excited. And we were very fortunate because we pitched it to the 7 studios, and Apple was the one who was going to give us a long theatrical run and also put it on their streaming service. So, and they were going to make the movie the right way. They didn't want to cut corners. And so we went with them. And then the challenge was to get F1 involved. And so how do we do that? How do we get them to agree to do it? Because when we first approached the Navy way back on the first Top Gun, they didn't want to have any part of us. And we had to shoot it at Miramar, which is where the Top Gun school is. The admiral of the base said, I don't want you here. So we went to Washington, Tom Cruise and myself, and met with the Secretary of the Navy. And John Lane was really smart. He knew what that would do for the Navy. He replaced the admiral, he moved the admiral off that base and gave us access. But they were still kind of iffy what they gave us, but we still got enormous access. The movie comes out, the recruiting goes up 500%. So we went back for the second one, they said, what do you need?
Yeah, exactly.
What do you need? So it was a courting process, but we were much smarter this time. We went directly to Stefano. So we didn't go through all the intermediaries that can say no. And he was, how can we help you? What can we do? And then it was a process to convince the teams they're not going to be the bad guys. And since Mercedes built the car and there was a rivalry with Red Bull, Christian, of course, felt that, oh my God, we're going to be the villains here. And so it was a process of showing him things, we showed all the teams and the drivers how we did Top Gun and how we're going to do this movie by skinning the cars the way we skinned the jets in Top Gun. And they slowly became on board. They were less skeptical. And yesterday I showed Christian the new trailer, and he understands now exactly what the movie is.
Yes, because I remember there was a little bit of concern at one point.
Yeah.
Who would be the villain of the piece,
exactly.
right?
There is the villain. It's the competition between our two drivers. That's what the story is. Not that we don't have, competition in driving, but still, it's really about those two guys. And they've been so helpful in creating the kind of access that we needed to make this movie, and that was so important because, we had slots at every race, between qualifying and other parts of hot laps or whatever they had going on the track. We would get 5 minutes or 10 minutes to put Brad out there in the car on every track that we needed to go to. So we had to work with the promoters of the track. It was a big organizational thing. And we had to prove to them, if you give us 5 minutes, we're off in 5 minutes. It's not 5.5 minutes, it's 5 minutes. And so we built up the confidence with all the different tracks. The hardest one was Vegas because they'd never done it before. So they were the most scared. But we did get access, and then next year we got even more access. So they realized that we're men of our words and got everything done on time. So it's just been a phenomenal experience for me to be a part of this world at a high level, to see how it actually works, and to meet with, all the engineers, all the team principals, all the drivers, and just that kind of access nobody really gets other than you.
Yeah.
So
the buy-in for across the board from stakeholders, teams, drivers, and ever seems to have been totally fundamental to the way that you want to do it.
Exactly.
What I've witnessed on site in terms of the areas where you've asked different bits of time to be given up, or locations to be used. I remember at one point when we were at Silverstone, it would have been the second time around, and we were told about, just there will be something in the mix zone around the media pen. Try not to react when certain people turn up and stuff like this. How different a movie would we have without that level of buy-in from everybody?
We wouldn't have made it. I mean, quite frankly, unless we do it the right way, we're not going to make it. So that's just the way it works. But I think the fact that we had Lewis as the entree, we knew he's not going to bless something unless, how particular Lewis is. So he knew Joe had previously met, and they talked about Top Gun. So he had a confidence in Joe. And I just saw him yesterday, and I said, because he's seen the movie a number of times in various forms. I said, how do you feel? And he said, you guys lived up to everything you said you were going to do.
You mentioned the drivers and your drivers, the actors. Big call to have them driving the cars themselves. I think it's great. There's two elements of it that I think have had from the teasers and the trailers we've seen that I think you can see already have a big impact. One is the fact that they are driving. You can tell, which I think is a big deal. And as you mentioned earlier, with the technology you're using, the cameras, actually being sat inside the car creates a kind of visceral feeling that just special effects and external shots don't capture. So where did the idea of having the actors drive come from, and how tricky was that to get it all signed off and actually turn into a reality?
Well, it was Joe. Joe wanted to do it as real as you can possibly do it. And Brad the same way. Brad said, I have to drive. I'm not making this movie if you're doing visual effects or CGI. I got to do it. And even when we were casting for Damson's role, we put him out in a car before we cast him to see if he could drive. And if he wasn't coordinated, he wouldn't have got the part. And he was great. He's a good athlete. And I think even Lewis was surprised what a good athlete Brad is. Because don't forget, he'd done a lot of motorcycle work and riding, so he had really good hand-eye coordination. So he was a natural when he got in the car. Damson, coming from England, they don't drive much there. So it was a little more of a learning process for him, but he caught on really quickly.
Everything that you've done on this film, and certainly everything that we've been able to see, I think we understand, seeing it from the inside, the importance of doing the best job possible, not just in terms of making a great Hollywood film, an entertaining Hollywood film, but something that works for Formula One. And I do hope that is something that people buy into when they watch it as well. But you're obviously, it's not just, you have a bit of a line to tread, I suppose, between people who are already in love with F1, can be quite protective about Formula One, but also a whole new audience as well. So what do you want, for example, people who already love F1, what do you hope they get out of this film? What do you want from them in terms of buying into your film?
I want them to see that we made the movie the right way by having our actors actually drive, by working with Lewis, working with all the various teams, working with F1, and to show we did everything possible to make the movie as authentic as possible, understanding it's still a Hollywood movie. It's not a documentary, so you have to understand that. But everything that Brad and our drivers do in the races, a Formula One driver has done in the past. So all these tricks that he does, because he doesn't have a fast car, other drivers have done this. Now, some of your fans won't realize that. Oh, that never happened. It happened. So the things that he's doing are what's happened in the fashion. In fact, you know, there's a crash in the movie, and it's based on the Martin Donnelly crash. So it's that, and we got his permission. We did all the right things to do it.
And for new fans, that access that you've had, taking them inside Formula One and literally inside the car as well, what world are you trying to show new fans?
How exciting this world is, what gifted athletes these drivers are. Nobody realizes, unless you do a hot lap, how difficult it is and what your body goes through just doing one lap. These guys are doing 50 laps every other weekend or every weekend. So I think we show the beating it takes and what it takes, how you have to train, what you have to do during the week prior to the race. We try to touch on every little aspect of it to add to the authenticity. But I mean, as an example, just Brad was driving Daytona because first we had him in dune buggies, and Lewis said, no, you can't go from that into an F1 car, but you could from driving in Daytona, the 24-hour race, going into one of our cars. And then we showed him the first section, and he said, not right. He needs to have lessons on about the steering wheel. He just can't get in that car and understand the steering wheel. So we do a little section of him being briefed on the racetrack and it's just those little details that he added to add to the authenticity, which I hope fans will understand. And we, you know, his age, you know, you see online, oh, you know, he couldn't be able to drive the car. We deal with it in the movie. So we try to touch all the buttons that a real F1 fan would say, oh, wait a second.
Yeah. One final question I have on kind of the final product, and now we're going into that bit where the clock's ticking now down to when people will see this, the world will see what you've created. What are you feeling for that? How much of it is excitement? Do you feel a sense of pressure and responsibility to have delivered, because you've obviously put so much effort into it, you've had all this access, you've had this opportunity to create this film, and then that you've got to let it out into the world soon. So how do you feel about
It's
that?
always scary, because as smart as we think we are, and this movie tested very high, but I've had movies test very high that nobody showed up. But they're still good movies, as people weren't interested. You know, it's our job to market the movie to the non-F1 fans, because we'll get a lot of the racing fans. It's the other fans we need. When we previewed the movie, we did what they call a blind preview, which means you're invited to a film, we're not going to tell you what it is. So we announced the title, and some of the women said, I have no interest in racing. We did a focus group afterwards, and that same woman said, I wanted to leave. I love this movie. I rated it excellent, and I'm going to tell my friends to go see it. So we got to get her in the theater, and we got to get a younger audience in the theater. And that's with the music activation we're doing here. We're going to do some stuff with the Academy to get them to see the movie, because when we did the testing, it was 50-50 who liked the movie. Both men and women were equally as enthusiastic about the movie, because you'll see it about racing, but it's an emotional story. It's dramatic. It's a perfect summer movie because it's got romance, action, and humor. And plus all the artists that we have 17 tracks on the album. Really diverse, from rock and roll to rap to country to Afro beats. It's got because we knew it's a worldwide sport, so we try to touch a lot of different countries with our music.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
How about the writing side? Because I think almost that's the weakest point of the film, in that I feel like a lot of the actors haven't got much to work with. It's quite. It's not. I've seen different opinions from different reviewers on this, but I thought, as far as Brad Pitt's concerned, it's a relatively uncharismatic Brad Pitt. You'll see much more lively character performances from him. Obviously, Damson Idris does a good job, but hasn't got much to work with. Javier Bardem's a very, very fine actor, but his kind of character sort of seems to go nowhere after an okay start. And then you've got obviously the technical director character played by Kerry Condon, who I must admit that there's two female characters working directly on the race team who are fairly poorly treated by the writers, I would say, which I find strange given that there's been kind of a desire to have sort of positive representation for different groups in F1 in this movie, and I was a little bit surprised that they were happy with that. So I feel that within the context, it's very difficult to write a sports movie. I think that's where F1 the movie struggles quite a bit.
Yeah, but I think this is the problem of being in F1 movies. You're kind of hemmed in. If anyone picks their top 10 movies, there's guaranteed to be, wild, outlandish fantasy worlds that have been created. If we think of, The Matrix, for example, The Matrix had freedom to, do amazing special effects and game-changing storyline and something that will stand the test of time and will go down as a film that everybody should watch. But with Formula One, you're hemmed in by, you're a team boss, you're one of two drivers, you've got a technical director, and you're doing the same thing at just basically 8 racetracks around the world to try to achieve the same things. There's actually quite little freedom within a storyline to try to develop stuff. So I think it's actually quite a difficult thing to achieve. And this is potentially why racing movies have, failed a lot in the past. It's actually quite difficult to build a framework around it unless you start getting utterly ludicrous, like Driven, and, you start, Brad Pitt comes out of Cops and turns left and goes under the tunnel, and they start having a race down to the A43 to Northampton or something. If you want to keep it authentic, you're quite hemmed in, and I think that makes it quite difficult to build a storyline around. The kind of makes it semi-realistic, even if you're never going to have it totally realistic.
Yeah, challenging one. I think almost the realism needed to take a bit of a backseat to the storytelling, and perhaps that was a limitation. I did ask, we had a press conference in Montreal, I asked Kaczynski and Bruckheimer if there was ever a time when kind of the close association with F1 limited them a bit, and of course they all said no, it didn't. But I'm pretty convinced the close collaboration with F1, while it made it all possible and makes the amazing visuals work, etc., I think it probably hamstrung them a little bit in some areas as well. At the same time, nothing's ever entirely positive. But one thing that was quite interesting is obviously they make a lot of the fact that both Brad Pitt and Damson Idris did plenty of driving, worked their way up to being able to drive the dressed-up F2 cars, and we saw them on track a number of races, in fact, lapping, and that helps the authenticity. But also, they stitch in the kind of real world. But I almost felt that both those aspects, the fact those two drivers were driving and the fact that it's kind of mixed in with the real world, weren't played on that well, because there's a few moments where there's cameos from people in F1, good bits like you have the national anthem they filmed at Silverstone in 23 where Brad Pitt and Damson Idris are stood there next to Verstappen and all the other drivers, but it felt very disconnected from the rest of the F1 world, which I know probably they had to an extent, but I just wonder if that opportunity was made the most of as perhaps it was promised it would be.
I think that's quite a hard kind of line for any film to take if you're going down the F1 route, because from our perspective, you spot the cameos, you spot Stefano Domenicali congratulates them at one point, you spot Toto Wolff.
That was not a good, that was a very self-conscious cameo, that Domenicali one. I don't think that one worked very well, to be honest.
Toto Wolff trying to sign another driver while he still hasn't got a contract with George Russell right at the very, very end. Will Buxton does his appearance as the commentator. We see Natalie Pinkham as well asking a question at the press conference. So there are elements that we see people from the F1 world, but I'm not sure if they will resonate with people outside. People who, if you've not seen a Formula One race, you aren't going to know who Stefano Domenicali is. You'll see Zach and Fred Vasseur sit on a press conference and not realise if these are the real team bosses, are they the fake team bosses?
But I think as a film watcher, you'll at least know they were opposing team bosses. So kind of narratively, that at least makes sense. So that one I thought was, well, I'm not sure that scene's especially necessary. That one at least didn't labour it too much. So I think it would make sense even if you didn't know who they were. But yeah, take your point.
But I think you are right that it actually works better when the apex people have put into the Formula One world. So like that British Grand Prix national anthem thing. I mean, I remember standing there watching it unfold in real life. It was the first time we'd seen apex at a race and Brad Pitt there, and it looks fantastic. They look to be part of Formula One. And I think that's what needed to be achieved. But yeah, on the flip side, you know, I wonder, out of the, you know, likely millions of people who are going to watch this film, how many will be able to come out afterwards and see a photo of Stefano Domenicali and actually be able to name him.
There's also there's a scene in it where the nightclub scene where there's a mention of Carlos Sainz, and that'll be quite amusing for people who know who Carlos Sainz is, but it's going to baffle the hell out of moviegoer. There's no context for it. If you were watching that, you'd think, "Oh, which character's Carlos Sainz? Who's that?" That was really quite strange. But there's also I think one of the very good things about this that will recommend it to F1 fans watching it is there's also, as well as at the track, there's filming away from the track as well. So, for example, they film in the Mercedes driver and loop simulator, so you see a little bit of that. They film in the Williams wind tunnel. That's the actual Williams wind tunnel, their F1 wind tunnel, and that you see the kind of the laser scanning setup and everything, and that's something you never see. So that's quite positive. You see a little bit of McLaren's base as well, which is the Apex GP base. So there's lots of little glimpses, but I think for me, and I think speaking specifically as someone who wants to go and see a good movie who's an F1 fan, it's a little bit like Drive to Survive in that I have problems with Drive to Survive, but there's bits in it, there's things you can take out of it, sort of isolated bits that work very well and are very revealing, but it's not necessarily strung together in the best possible way. And that's where I feel this movie is definitely worth watching as an F1 fan, ideally in IMAX, to get that visual spectacle and for some of those glimpses you get. And you just kind of accept that as a movie, it's not quite as successful as it might be, which in turn, well, that's good for our audience. I worry a little bit for the wider movie-going audience.
I mean, that Drive to Survive comparison is quite interesting because I have kind of real conflicts about watching Drive to Survive sometimes, because I do like seeing some of the behind-the-scenes aspects. They get some of the raw emotions and snapshots because they're everywhere, and you see kind of behind the curtain to a lot of these people. But then equally, there are fake narratives put in there, and the story gets changed, which for something that's supposed to be factual, it's not a piece of fiction. It's supposed to be a documentary. I don't like, because you can get a wrong impression of what's happened based on what's come out. Whereas the film, for example, I find it quite similar to that Drive to Survive aspect. Is there are behind the scenes aspects that are quite cool. Seeing the Williams wind tunnel action looked great. I don't know how much of the kind of graphic screens and data tools I had that are real and how much was manipulated, but it looked fantastic. Seeing the driver in the loop.
It's quite realistic, because like the desk they're sitting at, that's the Williams wind tunnel. They shot there for 4 days, so it's pretty realistic. In fact, they had to do quite a lot of assurances to the FIA, because obviously the wind tunnel was being turned on and used, to say this is not some sneaky way to do wind tunnel testing. It is just like the data wasn't acquiring, so it wasn't data on, but all the stuff in it, the desks, the Kerry Condon character sat there, that's all completely authentic.
Yeah, and then seeing the simulator as well was quite cool, because very rarely do we get to see simulators in action. So all those aspects were good, and then I could put up with those kind of the fictional aspects of it, because this is a piece of fiction. It's not a real real movie. It's not a real movie. So I had far less problems coping with the elements that of kind of the step above authenticity with this than I do sometimes on Netflix, when they're trying to deliberately stir up fake rivalries or stuff that's fake, or changing the timeline of events to suit circumstances. I found actually the F1 movie was much better on that front. And I think most telling for me was the film's 2.5 hours long, roughly. And I didn't look at my watch once. And this was we watched in Canada quite late, so we're all jet lagged. So the very fact I watched all the way through the film and didn't look at my watch once tells you how much actually I must have quite enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's a positive. So, final verdict. Let's have your final verdict on it. If you're John Noble, movie reviewer, is it worth seeing for an F1 fan and for a general movie fan? And how successful is it as a big blockbuster movie?
I think absolutely, if you're an F1 fan, you should see it. Don't expect it to be a game-changing movie that goes into your top 10 best ever films ever. I think you've got to go in with realistic ambitions. But as a racing movie, it works. It's got its faults, but it's got some brilliant aspects. You see elements of F1 and TV views and kind of some of that more raw emotions of racing that you don't get from normal life. That there are some bits you can laugh at, there are some bits you can think this is ludicrous. But I think if you want to spend 3 hours of your life being entertained in a way that you aren't going to feel shortchanged having paid some money to go and watch, I would definitely go and see it.
Yeah, I definitely think for an F1 fan, see it. I'm concerned that it goes off the rails a bit. I think I would have loved to have seen the movie that is the first 20-25 minutes continue. And there's things in that, obviously, that you have to suspend disbelief. Well, the Daytona stuff's really impressive, but also the first Silverstone stuff, I think, works well. I almost feel like I don't know. Obviously, a huge amount of work and science been put into it, but I just feel like the on-track stuff lost its way a little bit. So, for me, I do agree. I wasn't losing interest in it or falling asleep or anything, and so, if that reflects kind of the universal movie going experience, it'll be okay for people. But I think my big problem is it feels like it's a bit of a missed opportunity. And it's okay. It's got its good bits. It's got its bad bits. I feel it could have been even within the bounds of what it is. I think it could have been a little bit better. So yeah, I'm intrigued to see how it does with kind of the ordinary cinema going public. And like I said, the professional movie critics reviews seem to be all over the shop on it, and that surprises me a little. I mean, I know everyone will have different opinions, but you can't actually say there's a consistent picture of what people think of it. So I'm really interested, and I'm actually quite interested to see how I find it when I see it again. So I'm going to go and see it. I'll probably see it a couple more times, and in fact, we're going to do a members only podcast. Myself and a few colleagues when we see it again in IMAX, just to have a full on spoiler-tastic members only version where we talk through it. So I'm interested just to see what I make of it when I see it again, and if some of my concerns are allayed with it. Because when you watch through it again from the start, you know what's coming, so you can kind of see, for example, like you said, that antagonist that kind of emerges at the end seems very tacked on. Who knows? Maybe there's some obvious hint I missed early on, and I'm doing them a disservice. So that's what I want to see. But yeah, it's it ultimately is a big blockbuster. It's very middle of the road. It's not as good as, say, Top Gun Maverick, and I think it's I fear it's going to be a very forgettable big summer blockbuster. That's the kind of feeling I took away from it. But the film going public will decide, and I'll be fascinated to hear what listeners to this podcast think. So particularly those in the members club, let us know in the community what you think of it, and your comments on this podcast, and see how well it goes down. But definitely go and see it in IMAX. Go for the full on visual impacts. The sound editing, particularly early on, is very, very good. But yeah, I'm now waiting for Daytona 24 Hours, the movie. That's what I'm waiting for. That should be their next project. So anyway, thanks very much, John, for your insight. Thanks to Scott earlier for his interview, and thanks for Jerry Bruckheimer taking the time to speak to us to explain. And to everyone who's going to go and see this at the cinema, we hope you enjoy it.